more industrialized and so on. And then, paradoxically, because most of these countries post-independence were so engulfed in resolving these ideological and nation-state identity-related issues and paying less attention to the economic development part, you end up, with them being less transformative than the last part of the colonial period. And then, even the small timid attempts that were made in the 60s and the 70s were reversed by the structural adjustment policies. And this is something that I assess in the book quite densely. But the reason the structural adjustment program came, it was not like some would like to frame another sort of wave of imperialism and all that. Obviously, there are elements of that in terms of, Western concentration of power through trade, through intellectual property, through financialization, and you name it. But it was more sort of a naive attempt on the part of economists that were well-intentioned to sort of reproduce certain liberal ideas without, taking into account context and without basically wanting to understand that the global dimensions were as important as the internal.
Absolutely. And that, that's a neat segue because, we talk about the need for structural transformation. We've talked about some of the difficulties in creating a coherent state which focuses on the policies that might continue economic transformation from, the post-colonial period onwards. What impact did this structural adjustment period have on the attempt to build states to make more coherent local economic actors?
I think the biggest damage was the establishment of a patronizing attitude towards African development experiment. So all of a sudden, there was a blueprint. There were a number of conditionalities that have to be followed by the countries, and what the different countries had to do was to follow the blueprint and get their best talent trained to interpret these policies, not to formulate policies, but to interpret these policies. And, conditioned so much the thinking that during those two decades, it was impossible to be different without being taxed as radical and be marginalized. The countries could not afford, sort of the possibility of alternative views. So they will themselves do the job of marginalizing internally whoever was a dissenting voice from this conditionality, very well structured interpretation of the world and what needed to be done. And then you end up with, quite dramatic situations of intellectuals not being able really to contribute to their to the formulation of their country's policies, and therefore becoming anti-structural adjustment and anti-elite as in one same sentence. So the things became the same, indistinguishable. And that is very sad because these voices, as a result, in most cases, and you just look into the scholarly produced contributions from Africa during that period, became also quite ideological and incapable of, distinguishing also some of the dimensions of economic policy that needed to be present. Like, I will give you an example. We need good fiscal policies. So all of a sudden, you just hear the word fiscal and you are against it. when in fact, you can't do structural transformation without having good fiscal policies. So it became a very weird debate between external driven views patronizing elites in Africa and dissenting voices, extremely ideological, incapable of seeing some of the necessary conditions for transformation to be pursued.
Every time I talk about this, people do say things have changed, that the examples of South Korea, China, Japan, etc., have filtered through now, and the IMF itself is a lot more open, etc. Is that fair? Do you think it's now? Do you think people are genuinely pragmatic, or is that lip service?
I think a lot. Yeah, I think a lot has changed, and in the book, actually, I find fascinating to dwell into the contradictions, not the contradictions, the debate, the lively debate within the Bretton Woods institutions, particularly the IMF, and how the strongest criticism, because grounded and much more sharp, came from within the institution, and how, part of the death of the Washington Consensus was, the result of this debate internal to those organizations and institutions. So I think that is the beginning of a much more wider view of the world, thanks to, the successes of Asia, thanks to some individuals that played key roles in terms of, bringing new ideas, some of the chief economists of the World Bank and the IMF. And I think also from the outside pressure that, mounted and became much more strident. But I think Africans have not seized yet how much freedom they have gotten. Policy space is still something that you have to fight for, but it has become much more easier for Africa to make its case in terms of being different or independent, having policy choices much more available than before. And I think the countries that realize this are doing very well, because they are kind of in their mindset evolved, but not all countries are at that stage.
Just on this sort of sensitivity about, whether or not you admit, I think that's the word, you admit you're doing this taboo thing of industrial policy. I remember asking a question in a public press conference at an African Development Bank meeting in Marrakesh, and said, would he recommend, would the Minister of Finance of Rwanda recommend the industrial policy that Rwanda is doing right now to his peers in the East African community? And the response was incredibly hostile. And, there was a complete denial that the state was involved in the economy at all, which is, Rwanda better than most. It's not true. The state does play, I think, a relatively intelligent role in supporting, various parts of the economy. But, at the time, so it was maybe 6-7 years ago, it still seemed to be a very taboo subject.
Yes, and in fact, it's a bit of ignorance about how the current countries that we classify as industrialized have obtained such status. All of them with amazing interventions from the state, a state that was quite present, that was decisive. And, if you just do a bit of economic history and you realize that there's really nothing new in this. We keep referring to Asia because it's the most recent example of a region that has adopted such an approach. But in fact, they have just copied themselves in terms of approach. They have just copied themselves earlier historical examples of state intervention, starting with the United States, with Hamilton. So this is nothing new.
No, it really isn't, and yet it does seem that the policy space has to be fought again and again and again. I mean, one of the things that is fast approaching, in the next half century, will be dramatically different weather patterns. Will be very large requirement for jobs, which many African countries are going to see their demography outstrip their job creation rates. The need for speed has really never been greater. Who for you, because it's very easy to get bogged down in pessimism in all this, but who for you on the continent is really leading the way in terms of affecting this structural transformation, and also doing it in a way that creates mass employment as opposed to the employment of capital, as it were?
Well, the examples that normally people quote are Ethiopia and Rwanda, and I think my book gives some idea that you need a combination of factors. Some are, of course, determination and ambition, and this country definitely possess it. But I also mention in an entire chapter my idea that respecting diversity is absolutely key. So if you don't do it at a given point, you get trapped, and that's what is happening right now in Ethiopia. It's not enough just to have speed and have good economic policy, have excellent policy space conquered. You need also to respect diversity. That was the problem with Ethiopia, that now in front of them, and they are tackling it. But it is something that confirms my thesis. And then I think we should look into other examples. I think we should look into what is happening in countries like Mauritius, that has now entered its third wave of transformation. So it's a country that has a lot to show in terms of not being content with attaining a certain level of transformation, but immediately going for the next wave. I think we need to look into what is happening right now in countries like Morocco, where in a number of value chains they have progressed faster than anybody else. I think it is important also to look into experiences of countries that are putting logistics and supply chains at the top of their agenda, like Djibouti and Togo, that have really created amazing synergies around just ports. I think we need to look into countries like Cote d'Ivoire and Ghana, because they have now decided to accelerate industrialization, and it's showing. Senegal is following them very closely as well. So I would say that a number of countries are entering into that stage of transformation, but we still don't see a coherent whole, as we'll see, for instance, in the case of Rwanda, as in the case of Morocco. I think probably those are the two countries that have the most coherence between the different elements of the equation.
It does seem that the sort of accelerated developmental state style thing does exacerbate the sort of ethno-nationalist problem. There are 30 million Oromo, I think, and those sort of more progressive political conversations that happen over centuries or are still happening. I mean, there is a temptation in Europe to look down on the political struggles in Africa, which is totally wrong when you see the old unions like the United Kingdom suddenly put under incredible stress because political problems were buried a century ago and not examined. And I think the whole of Europe is going to encounter these problems over the next few decades. But it does seem that this accelerated developmental state does exacerbate the ethno-nationalist problem. who for you has, I mean, we talked about the success stories in those African countries who got the acceleration right. Who for you have got the other side of the coin right? This sort of